Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes and today I'm here with Dr. David Zaruk. He is the Risk-Monger on the internet. Of course, he has a blog with the same name. He has been an EU risk and science communication specialist since 2000. Active in EU policy events from reach and scale to the Pesticides Directive, and from science in society questions to the use of the Precautionary Principle. He was part of the team that set up GreenFacts to encourage a wider use of evidence-based decision-making in the EU on environmental health matters. Dr. Zaruk is also a professor at Odisee University College in Belgium, where he lectures on communications, marketing, EU lobbying, and PR. So, Dr. Zaruk, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Ricardo.
Okay, great. Okay, so on the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks, Ricardo.
Okay, great. Okay, so I would first like to ask you, because since you've been dealing with activists and activists that work mainly in environmental issues for a long time now, what are some of the main tactics that they use to try to convince people to sympathize with them and with their approaches and with their proposals, such as policies and things like that?
Well, there are different types of activists, of course, within the environmental domain. I think that's one of the important points to keep in mind, is that there are some activists who are very much committed to improving public health or in developing better environmental decisions. There are also, though, many activists who are more agenda-driven, in particular with an anti-industry campaign or anti-science, although they don't consider that, they group science and industry together. But it's very much a fear that technology is going to harm humanity and the environment. And there it's a different approach. It's very much clearly a marketing, communications, PR campaign to try to change the nature of the debate and the affect public perception along a fear-based approach. So I think fear is the first tool that an activist will use, and fear can rise from uncertainty. Fear can rise from threats of negative consequences of harm. And they play with the public misunderstanding of risk to a certain degree. And that's where I found it quite interesting to study that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and isn't it also the case that one of the big problems with the approach that some activists have is that when they try to come up with solutions to very big and complex problems like, for example, climate change, they usually oversimplify the problem and come up with one or two solutions to it that they think that by themselves would solve it. Correct.
Yes, one of the problems with uncertainty, and particularly the field of uncertainty management, is that complex solutions are perhaps more frightening and raise more doubts and uncertainty. So simplicity is a very key point in their messaging, that we can save the world by simply changing a light bulb or stopping all present forms of energy, save a few renewable sources. And people want a simple answer. I think there's certain human nature to a point that, the path of least resistance is what most humans want to take. Now, what happens at a certain point is that these simple answers are quite dangerous and could lead to even greater problems. In energy, of course, we're beginning to see that now. The German simple solution, let's get rid of all nuclear, has caused some great consequences. The organic industry's lobby approach to let's get rid of all chemicals and synthetic chemicals and crop protection materials is starting to lead to some issues that is making it very difficult for farmers to do their work. So while people crave simplicity, usually simplicity will lead to a more serious consequences, I think, for humanity and the environment.
Mhm. And earlier you referred to the fact that they also are usually anti-corporation and anti-capitalism and things like that. So what is the big issue with that? Is that the fact that perhaps when they criticize capitalism because, for example, they think that capitalism leads to more inequality, or that it affects the downtrodden or the poorer people, and things like that, that perhaps they get it backwards, and capitalism really contributes to better and better quality of life for more and more people over time? Is that it?
Well, there's been a strong evolution in the what was originally a far left approach against industry, and as if we were to follow the globalization and the global trade agreements, it has brought enormous wealth and prosperity, particularly to a lot of developing countries. The idea, though, of a globalized, series of companies has terrified a lot of people who are more towards a small, local, community-based approach to the world, and they see suddenly this capitalist system very heavily influencing global politics. Now, this is not the case, actually. I mean, if you look back at the large corporations in the 1970s compared to today, you would see that industry itself is a much smaller player in the global political scheme. In fact, a lot of the NGOs are having more influence than these companies. Secondly, these companies have very strong CSR policies, and they're doing a lot of very good things to help deal with inequalities, probably more than governments are doing in many cases. So the reality on the ground is quite different from the perception these groups are presenting. A good example is a company that was formerly known as Monsanto. It was presented as this large organization, essentially bigger than governments, that was able to convince all scientists to support them, essentially buy all science and control the world, control the food supply, control farming. Well, they're even within the industry they were operating in, they were not the largest player. In fact, as a company, they were about the same size as Whole Foods, an American organic food distribution retail chain. And they were not the sort of large, powerful force that these groups have played it out to be. But this is all really part of their, I don't want to say propaganda, but part of their campaign to present any industry as being corrupt and not being able to be trusted. And it's a game of trust that they've done very well to create distrust and uncertainty in companies that are bringing the technologies that the world needs to live with in the future.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the worst consequences that we may get from having NGOs and certain types of activists with too much lobbying power in the political realm?
Well, we're seeing some signs already. I have to be careful not to be too alarmist, but I really am terrified at what I'm seeing more and more. Scientists are no longer welcome in the debate. Industry has been excluded from the debate for quite a while now. But the idea, quite simply, is that the activists want to make sure to exclude as many people who would be dissenting from their views as possible. That's a normal lobbying practice, but it's quite an unethical practice as well. And the NGOs have done very well. Just recently, Greenpeace, for example, had a report where they were outraged that in the European Parliament, 54% of the people, the MEPs involved in the Agri Committee that deals with questions of agriculture, had some ties to a farm or had their parents who grew up on a farm. And they were outraged that there would be such interest group representing farming. So even farmers now are considered as dangerous to the process of deciding issues related to farming. So that sense of remove the experts, because the experts are all in some way paid by industry or paid to have certain views, would leave us a view of a citizen science approach where expertise is considered not necessarily important. So by removing the experts, you're removing a lot of knowledge that would be vital to good, sound policy decisions. And we're beginning to see many issues, several in the area of crop protection in particular. Several pesticides have been banned in the EU, and farmers are struggling to find a way to continue to get the yields and the harvests that they used to get using older technologies, which are far more toxic for the environment.
Mm-hmm. So you think that in the European Union, when it comes to environmental policy, that perhaps we're now living in an atmosphere of people being like anti-experts? Is that it?
Yes, and there's another parallel evolution in this present European Commission, which frightens me as well. In previous commissions, there was always this reliance on what was considered as an inter-service consultation. What that means is, if I give you an example, when I was working on REACH, REACH was not simply about chemicals related to the environment, although DG Environment was one of the main Director Generals involved in that. It was also a concern for industry, and so at the time DG Enterprise was involved in the process. And chemicals were also, in this case, a concern for health. And so at that time, DG Sanko was involved. So you can, and another good example, Scale, which was related to children's health, also involved DG Research. So you can see then that you have different stakeholders involved from the different DGs involved in the policy process. It's quite simply, if you want to have a good decision, invite people with different views together and have everybody present their views. Well, under the present commission, and I don't think Juncker had very much control over the present commission. I think there was a gentleman by the name of SlimeGate who was the Bismarck of Brussels, who controlled a lot of how the process worked. And quite simply, I have not seen an inter-service consultation process anymore. And I think the idea is that each policy decision is made within the confines of one DG, where the people within the head of the commission, particularly this Bismarckian character, are able to keep a good control on what happens. And so if we look at agriculture, for example, then the most decisions that were made by DG Santé, the Health Commission, which has no interest in farming. And so when you ban a certain product because it may affect the bees or it may not, there's no one in that Director General that understands what farmers have to do and what alternatives are going to be brought in. So if you talk to somebody in DG Agri or DG Ag, they will tell you what's important for the environment, for example, with conservation agriculture and no-till farming, and how a substance like glyphosate can be essential for the environment. But this idea that there could be a risk to glyphosate is considered only on health grounds in DG Santé. And it was very difficult for DG Santé, the Health Commission, to push through a clear renewal of this product. If you were to bring out the agricultural benefits, nobody would have thought twice about renewing this substance. So by removing the consultation process, which is what SlimeGate effectively did in Brussels, you've created a a very bad policy structure. Now, that may not seem important to people who just assume that these are experts making decisions, but they're the wrong type of experts. It's like if I have a problem with my plumbing, I'm going to bring in an auto mechanic. Okay, he couldn't care less about how my water system works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so another question. Is it also the case that these activists and politicians that perhaps push for certain policies and create campaigns against, for example, glyphosate and GMOs in agriculture, that they don't really even talk with the people that work with those technologies, namely the agricultures?
Oh yeah, I mean that's obvious. There's no consultation going on now. First of all, we're in a world that's changed. I don't have to listen to you. I don't have to watch you. If I don't like you, I don't agree with your views, I just ban you, or I block you, or I make sure that you are not in my information feed. I choose who I want to listen to and who I want to believe. So we are now dividing ourselves into a world of tribes, and these tribes are very closed to different views. So if I control the source of my information, then I begin to only get information that confirms my bias. And I call this the age of stupid. Now, it doesn't mean that the other people are stupid and I'm not. What that means is because I've closed off myself from any other sources of information than what I agree with, who's to say I'm not the stupid one? And this is a real challenge today for discussions, because I will only have discussions with people who agree with me. So if we look at the debates going on today, and glyphosate was probably a good example, you had groups that only shared information to show how many people are suffering from cancers, and the evidence was not particularly good, but if you share it 1,000 times, it looks better. And they would only share information with people who agreed with them that glyphosate was probably the most toxic substance known to man, and it was everywhere. Whereas scientists in other communities will share information that shows that this is less toxic than salt or the ingredients in chocolate or biscuits. And so they're not communicating with each other. They're not coming to some consensus. They're within their own silos, and they're running their own, what is in their own interest. And so you can begin to see how what was essentially probably the most harmless synthetic chemical used in agriculture was starting to become more and more, through a type of evolution, extremely terrifying with a lot of people. They began to think it was in my Cheerios and my cereal in my morning. I was feeding this to my children. Of course, I'd have to feed them 3,000 boxes of cereal to get any level of toxicity. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that this information was shared within these closed communities, and they felt outrage. As whenever you've got communities of nervous people, you will get an opportunist who will come in and raise the outrage. In this case, it's the anti-GMO movement and the organic industry lobby that saw the opportunities. So you could take something like a completely benign chemical, perhaps glyphosate was called the herbicide of the century. And you can, within a period of 3 years, with the help of this anti-industry view of Monsanto as the great evil Satan of the industrial world, and you can create this bad guy, image of a dangerous chemical that's coming out in every thing we consume, and then start to add diseases, not just cancer, but then you can speak about it. People like Stephanie Seneff will go on with a whole list of things from autism through to leaky gut to the whole question of celiac disease. And and nobody is actually checking any of the facts with scientists because they're not in communication. There is a complete isolation within these groups. And so they're having their science, which is fitting their campaigns. And their campaigns are for obvious interests. And then you have the scientific community, which is more and more isolated because they're not invited to the table in the policy debates anymore. So you begin to see a rather strange thing happening. We're not speaking in a rational world. We're speaking in a world where fear, and particularly fear of chemicals, is becoming far greater than any human rationality could explain. It's quite fascinating when you think about it, that we're in this world where the most benign, useful, and and important chemical for farming has become the biggest fear that humanity finds faced. Now, when I see something like that, I have to look and say there's something going on here. And there's a lot going on. There's a lot of what I would say very malicious opportunism by certain actors. And because of social media and the world we're in, they're able to use these tools very effectively. And there are two areas in particular that I find it interesting. First, it's how glyphosate is not simply a herbicide. Okay, it's a herbicide tied to GMOs. Right. So there are no GMOs, save one in the European Union, that are being farmed at any point. So why is this such a big issue for Europe? Well, it's not. It's a big issue in the United States. But if I were an activist in the United States, how would I deal with this? How would I try to ban GMOs? Well, I couldn't ban it in the United States because if you look at most the way the political structure is, you've got a very large number of senators from farm states. They're not going to vote against the interests of farming. So there isn't going to be a good result in the US. But I can come across to Europe, which has this very much hazard-based precautionary principle approach to regulations. And I can ban it in Brussels. And if I can ban it in Brussels, then I can affect the exports from the United States of GM soy and maize, which will then affect the ability for farmers to make a living in the United States. Therefore, I can succeed. Now, I refer to these people as carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers goes back to after the American Civil War, when these opportunists from the North came down to take advantage of the chaos in the southern states and, more or less, run things to their advantage. Well, you've got Americans coming to Brussels now to create this fear in order to ban a substance that European farmers are using for sustainable agricultural practices like no-till farming and complex cover crops. And the farmers don't understand why such a useful herbicide is potentially going to be taken away from them. They don't want it to be taken away from them. There are no risks to this substance, and yet they're part of a global debate now, which has nothing to do with them. Now, that's the easy observation. I don't know if you want the more complex sort of story, or if you need to say.
But let me just ask you this, because I think that it is important to make this clear for the viewers and listeners here. Is there really any evidence for the approach that the European Union has for agriculture in terms of being against GMOs and against glyphosate, and even, I think, perhaps against pesticides in general, and at the same time promoting organic agriculture under the rubric of being aware perhaps of certain health issues and environmental issues that they associate with GMOs and glyphosate and all of those things? I mean, does this make sense in any way?
In a rational world, no. I mean, if you're going to talk to me about risks to my health, then you should talk what's in this cup of coffee that I have right here, because the number of chemicals that are here are quite enormous and quite toxic. In fact, if I follow Bruce Ames, and you can Google Ames plus coffee plus pesticides, Ames would say that there are more than 1,000 chemicals in this cup of coffee. We've only, I believe the number was 29. We've only been able, at this time in the 1980s, we'd only studied 29 of those chemicals, 19 of which were highly carcinogenic to rats. So ban this. So within a rational world, no. This is complete nonsense. The idea that these technologies, and they are technologies, will allow farmers to continue to feed a growing population is quite essential. The world was supposed to, if we follow Malthus, the world was supposed to collapse at 1 billion people, wouldn't be able to feed itself. If we follow somebody like Paul Ehrlich in the 1960s with his book, The Population Bomb, he was predicting by the 1980s that there'd be 100 million people a year dying of starvation. Okay, he didn't understand the power of agricultural technologies. And when we think about it, when was the last global famine that we had to deal with? Okay, that was back in the 1980s, and I only realized that when I was watching Bohemian Rhapsody and Live Aid, that there hasn't been recently any large food security crisis. It doesn't mean it won't happen anymore, but I think we've tended to assume that these things are safe. This is not due to organic farming or agroecology. This is due to the technologies that farmers have. So if we look at the debate is not at all about science. It's not at all about reason. It's about a view of the world that people want to have. And the view of the world is that they don't want technology. They want to have some sort of farming practice that goes back to the 1800s, because the idea of living in nature is good. Natural is what we want. And if something's not natural, then we have to stop it. This is a religious view. And I'm not going to argue with people who have this, religious view about not nature being good and bad. But in a scientific debate, you have to leave your bias at the door. You have to look at all the processes and see what works. If you say, well, we'll only work with chemicals that are, natural, that's organic farming uses pesticides, but only ones coming from nature. Well, that may not be the best. Those chemicals may not be the best things to put on our food. Copper sulfate is a good example. It's very destructive to the environment. It's very destructive to human health. But because it's organic, you have all of these green and socialist MEPs defending it. But at the same time, and they tell you how great organic wine is. Well, it's much more toxic. Well, first of all, wine on itself, you're going to drink ethanol, it's very toxic and carcinogenic, but that's why we drink it. But the idea that only one type of chemical is good it's a religious belief. And we shouldn't have religion coming into scientific discussion. Science is about finding the best and most effective means. And I fear that we will continue to make our food systems vulnerable as long as we let these religious zealots, and they are zealots, they don't want to have an open debate. They want to have their view imposed on everyone. But these eco-religious zealots are taking over the discussion, and it will make farming extremely difficult, it will make food extremely expensive, and it will create food insecurity that we have had the luxury of not seeing for the last 50 years.
Okay, so when it comes again to environmentalism in the EU, and now shifting gears a little bit to talk about energy sources, do you think that the EU is also betting on the wrong horse here when people are a lot against nuclear energy and perhaps are over-investing in renewable energy sources?
Well, this is a problem for the well-fed and the warm, well-sheltered people. When you're comfortable, you can make decisions that are not reasonable, and the consequences can be lived with. when the German government decided in a reaction to Fukushima that they would essentially get out of nuclear, it was not a scientific decision. It was a political decision of the horror of seeing the risk of a nuclear meltdown. That risk is very small. And even if we look at the numbers of Fukushima today, it's quite ridiculous. The levels of radiation are lower now in the zones that are still excluded than you'll find in the streets of central London. This is something a BBC report showed. So the number of deaths that have caused have been, in fact, I think there was only one person who died. It was a worker who had an accident during the Fukushima event. But just to see the reactions against nuclear, particularly at that time, was very emotional, and not taking into account A, the ability to manage risks, and B, the importance of nuclear within the energy mix, particularly if we have a concern about climate change. But there has always been that feeling against, particularly nuclear. I mean, there's also actions against fossil fuels as well. But the German decision has been a boom for the coal industry in any case. So there isn't not a lot of rationality going on. The idea that you can power the world with solar energy, and I'm not saying that it's not impossible, it's just not possible for the next 20 years or 30 years, and the amount of investment that you'll have to put in it is quite high. Now, that's an objective that a lot of people have because it's considered as renewable energy. The sun is, of course, a very powerful form of energy. So is the wind. Then again, so are tides and water as well. So these things do exist, but they don't exist at any point yet that would become, I would say, practical or efficient. So what happens? Well, you create an energy crisis when you take a major source of energy out of the mix. And this is what happened in Germany. Right now, I believe the numbers are quite high. They're about 30% of the German population. This is Germany, the richest country in Europe. 30% are now in a state of what they would call energy poor. And in fact, in the last year, 300,000 German homes had their power cut off because they couldn't afford to pay the bills. Once again, this is Germany, the richest country in Europe, has willfully hurt their consumers. Now, they're able to compensate. They're able to find energy, buy energy from nuclear energy from France, from elsewhere. But the idea to act now, before the other technologies are in any way efficient, is madness. But it's madness that is done not for any rational or scientific point, but rather for political, emotional, and environmental points. And if you look at it, of course, whenever you have those decisions, you can see some negative consequences. Now, I've confessed it before. I have solar panels on my roof. And I wrote an article where I called myself a hypocrite because I know very well that it is probably much more environmentally destructive for me to do that than to buy off the grid energy, which is coming from natural gas and coal. And nuclear. We still have nuclear in Belgium, but the Greens have been trying to shut it down for 20 years, and there's been, unfortunately, not enough investment. So why do I call myself a hypocrite for having solar panels? Well, because the level of technology today, in order to produce the energy needed to produce those solar panels, the energy needed to, in fact, everything from purifying the silicon through to the technology circuits, the glass, everything else, and not even counting the recycling, will not, the CO2 emissions from that production will not be recouped anytime soon, especially in lovely sunny Belgium, where I think last year we had in the month of December 10 hours of sunlight, and the sun is so low on the horizon it barely gets to my roof. So the idea that this will pay for itself, this is not the reality. The amount of CO2 that I'm releasing into the environment, Plus, my solar panels, I noticed after the third year, are producing less. Solar panels are not, renewable in the sense that they never stop. Every year, my production and emission of solar energy goes down until probably after around 7-8 years, I'll have to get new panels. So this is. I'm not saying that in the future the technology will not improve. It will. But why should I be paying in a sense of environmental destruction, on a belief that it's going to make things better? I'd rather pay for carbon capture storage, which would be far more efficient, or pay for better nuclear reactors, than pay for some technology that's going to cause a greater accumulation of CO2. And remember, CO2 is cumulative. So it's a little bit like investing when you're young. If you invest in your young, the market will compound and you'll do well. If I'm emitting CO2 today, it will compound and continue and become more in the future. So why not wait until the technology is good, instead of just attacking the industries that some activists don't like because they can, and they're getting paid, they're getting money. Largest lobbying groups in Brussels, by the way, are the wind and solar energies, because there's a lot of public money out there for them to be able to attract to. Not even going to talk about wind. I confronted someone from the wind industry. I did a back of an envelope calculation that about 40% of wind turbines will have serious technical flaws within 6 years, which is a bit remarkable. But if you think of how many cars people buy in the market that break down after 6 years, it's not that much. But when you see some of the malfunctions, some of the fires, very impressive fires that these wind turbines give, it's the amount that they're investing on these wind turbines for the limited time that they're able to produce energy. Once again, I'm not saying it's not going to improve in the future. It's just that is for the future. And this idea of renewables now, that's a very aggressive, militant environmental campaign, which is unfortunately doing more environmental destruction than it's helping.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now so I would like to move on to talk a little bit about your series that you've been posting about in your blog called SlimeGate. And I'm just going to quote you here because it is a 7-blog expose of how lawyers and American tort law firms have manipulated scientists and NGOs to redefine the public narrative on many health and environment issues, fitting them into a more litigation-friendly framework. So, could you please start off by explaining what are tort law firms, and perhaps then talk a little bit about a couple of examples, because I think that they really illustrate the tactics that these people resort to, and the tactics that you include in the activists' playbook, I guess, and things like that. So could you tell us about that?
This is a frightening issue, really, when you think about it, because we don't really see it that clearly in Europe. In fact, in Europe, we have a system which is, well, first of all, in Europe, we have a good healthcare system. Most countries do. We have also a general feeling that laws are followed and that the state is there to protect us. In the United States, it's a very litigious society. A litigious society means that many people will exchange cards with their lawyers' addresses more than their own business cards in many cases. And it's quite easy when there is a confrontation to look at someone's rights, not protected by the state, not protected through the institutions or healthcare organizations, but rather through the courts. And anyone who has spent any time in the United States, usually the first night in a hotel, they have the TV on and they're just amazed to see these commercials from law firms asking, have you got this cancer? Have you been wronged? Have you had a bad accident? Well, call this number and we'll get you millions. And so that get rich quick attitude as well, that the courts will provide justice through financial form, is quite strong in the United States. Now, the the industry, it's called the tort industry, but it's essentially a type of law which deals with personal damage. So if I have an accident and somebody hits me and I have a very sore neck, then given that my health care will probably go up and my coverage may not, be able to help me recover, I will take this person to court and I will be able to get a large amount of money. And that affects in part, also for medicines. If I take a certain medicine, I have a bad side effect, then I can sue either the pharmaceutical company or the doctor who prescribed it. Now, if you want to know why people don't have health care of the same quality in the United States that we enjoy in Europe, it has a lot to do with paying for the insurance that has to pay for these lawyers. So we're dealing with different worlds here and a different economic model. Historically, these tort law firms have done very well on two main, I'd say, business strategies. One is the tobacco industry, and the second is the asbestos industry. And they've provided large amounts of revenue, not just for the victims. The victims get normally less than half, because you don't pay for a lawyer. It's another difference. If I felt I was wronged here in Belgium, I will go sit down and talk to a lawyer, and I'll have to pay him a couple thousand euros just to have a first meeting with me. In the United States, the idea is that you have a fee on return. So I don't have to pay my lawyer anything, and my lawyer will decide to take the case. But as the damages are paid out, he will get she will get probably about half of the damages paid. In fact, some of the numbers I see is more than half at the moment. Some 60, 70% go to the law firms. So it's a very good business model for the law firms in particular. Now, what's happening? Well, after the tobacco agreement in the late 90s, there are no longer the ability to sue tobacco companies for cancers that are coming up today. The asbestos lawsuits, well, many of the asbestos companies are out of business and they're now in funds that will distribute money. So there's not a lot of money for asbestos litigation anymore. So you've got a large industry of law firms, everything from very big New York-based law firms to little groups and strip malls of independent lawyers who are looking for means of revenue. And they can't get them all from, bad drug reactions or, injuries in car crashes. So they are looking for new forms of cancers that can be identified and associated with certain products. And that's where it becomes quite interesting to see several things happening here. Because if you can identify a cancer and identify a cause, you may be able to get the next big tobacco. This is what why glyphosate is important, because you're able to find some farm worker or some groundskeeper who was using glyphosate. He now has a certain type of cancer. Therefore, you can take Monsanto to court. And of course, Monsanto has had a very bad reputation. What court is going to defend Monsanto or the science? They're going to look at this victim and not look at the law firms in particular that are behind it. So what you need to be able to do, though, is establish a link between the substance and the cancer. And that's rather difficult to do in a lot of situations, particularly with glyphosate. But there's this organization in Lyon, France called IARC, or IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer. And they've been publishing monographs. The one on glyphosate is a good example. They have another one on talc powder as well. And these reports are hazard assessments. They're different from a risk assessment. I can explain that maybe a bit later. But the hazard assessments essentially will say that there is a cancer, there is a substance, and in this substance is the potential that it could lead to that cancer. Of course, they're not talking about exposure. They're only saying that there is perhaps a relationship. And if you consider that IARC is, it's an independent autonomous organization, but it was recognized by the WHO. So they will simply say the WHO says this gives you cancer. That will be enough in a court of law for a non-scientific jury to say, oh, okay, it's the WHO, okay, the World Health Organization, it must be right. So we suddenly see this rather increased opportunity for law firms to work with scientists who will then be able to work with IARC to produce an outcome that can link a substance to cancer and then find all of the victims. At the moment, there are about 9,000 cases against Monsanto, well, now Bayer, against glyphosate. 9,000 cases, well, the first case had the original settlement was for 289 million. You can begin to see the disruptive possibilities that it could cause. Well, not to the company, because the companies are usually insured, and the insurance industry, of course, will pay these settlements like they did for the healthcare. It just means that food will become more expensive because it will have to be filtered in somehow to pay that off. But the law firms now, of course, are becoming much more aggressive involved in the policy debates to make sure that there's legislation against a substance like glyphosate. They're also very aggressively paying scientists who will go to IARC or who will speak out on behalf of the interests of the law firms. But given that these law firms like to protect their client, their client confidentiality, they speak about privileges that they have to protect the what they call the attorney privacy. They are not very transparent. And so we found situations, and it's very hard to find because most of them aren't published, where these law firms are paying scientists, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of US dollars. Now, one particular character was named Chris Portier, who did not disclose that he was being paid by law firms as he was lobbying the European Health Commissioner to ban glyphosate. So he's being paid by the law firms that want to sue Monsanto. In fact, he signed a contract 10 days after the IARC decision that showed glyphosate to be carcinogenic. So he went to Lyon with the purpose, essentially, of a nice retirement, is that they earn about around $500 an hour as a litigation consultant, much more than any university will pay a scientist. And I mean, if you get $280 million from a case, take $150 million for the law firms, what's a couple million to pay a scientist to ensure that the link is made? So it's changing. The law firms now are suddenly piling a lot of money, not just to the scientists, but also to activist groups as well. Because now they're funding NGOs, and they're doing it through different channels in order to create doubt about the substances. They're funding NGO research. They're also funding essentially campaigns by these NGOs to make the companies get a very bad reputation. What happens? Well, if you run a campaign against Monsanto for 3 years with maybe 20 million US dollars for social media campaigns, you can do a lot of damage to reputation. Anyone who's selected to a jury is not going to want to defend a company like Monsanto in the courts. So it's a very clear strategy, very cleverly played out. And when you start to look at how these tort law firms work, the money that's involved, the private jets, they have their own financing, which is, of course, not transparent as well. Then nobody knows how much money you can actually invest in these law firms. So I can invest in a company like Rights in Luxembourg, which is running many lawsuits against Monsanto, and I can get about 20% return on investment from the payouts. So actually, they're not waiting for the decisions of the courts. They're actually getting money from the funders for their fees. And there are many cases that I've shown in SlimeGate where these law firms actually end up with most of the money and the victims get nothing. So that's why it's SlimeGate. It's really slimy. It's also changing the nature of the debate. It's no longer about good science or public health. It's about law firms that want to sue companies. And it's changing the nature not only in the United States, but these people are, many law firms and lawyers came here during the glyphosate debate. Now, the tragic part here is that cancer is a major fear that we have today. Nobody, of course, wants cancer. I'm going through tests right now for my own health because something's going wrong with my body and we don't know what. So it's a major fear people have. But when you think about what is in reality happening, Bayer owns Monsanto. One of the other companies now, Johnson & Johnson, is facing 7,000 lawsuits against talcum powder and different types of vaginal cancers. And that is also tied to a very suspiciously poorly done IARC monograph on talcum powder, of which the chair of that one is also representing law firms in the United States as well. So you're beginning to see that this agency, IARC, which is supposed to be protecting and helping the world fight cancer, is in fact helping scientists to sue two companies, Bayer and Johnson & Johnson, that are doing more research and more help to try to prevent cancer than any other scientific organizations. And IARC, of course, is very anti-industry. They celebrated their 50th anniversary. 2,000 scientists were invited. Not one scientist from industry was invited. Not one of 2,000 people. So this is a very anti-industry organization, which is essentially screwing the population and leading to probably an increase of cancers. But the scientists who are working with IARC are also working with these US law firms. They're doing okay. Mm-hmm. That's slimy.
That's really, really scary and problematic. So could you now tell us then about the difference between hazard and risk? Because I think that this is a very important distinction for people to know about, and that really tort law firms and NGOs and paid scientists and activists exploit in their favor when they're trying to make cases against certain target chemicals that they choose and certain companies that produce them, in terms of them being carcinogenic or associated with any other type of health problem. So could you please tell us about that?
Well, it's a very simple equation. Risk equals hazard times exposure. I'm looking out my window right now and I'm looking on a street, and there are cars that are going by. Those cars are hazards. Hazards not only because of the emissions coming out of the backside, but also because they could hit a person. But I'm sitting comfortably inside my office, so I'm not exposed to the hazard. So that car is not a risk. Very simple. So what we have to do as risk managers is measure the exposure, and where we may see something as hazardous, we should reduce the exposure. If somebody on the street has a cigarette, okay, I'm not exposed to that. The person who's having that cigarette is exposing himself at the moment to a higher degree of hazard. He may decide that he's only going to smoke 2 cigarettes today, so he's doing his own risk management to a certain degree. So what we have to look at is how to control and how to limit the exposures where a hazard's identified. And that's basic risk management, and it's basic common sense. But in certain languages, German I believe is one, I don't know in Portuguese, risk and hazard are very similar, if not the same words. And so it's hard to explain to somebody that difference. And so if you identify something as a hazard, it's almost automatically considered therefore as a risk. And this is what's happening at times when you look at environmental pollution as well. What is the, if something goes in the ground, at what point, how much of an exposure in the soil will cause a problem? If you're dealing with air pollution as well, how much exposure to air pollution will cause respiratory problems? These things get rather difficult for some people to understand. There are some, for example, biologists who will speak about a low dose. Even the smallest dose, over a longer period of time will have a high effect. Others talk about a cocktail effect. That is not just that one cigarette that person is having a day. It may be in combination with other exposures to other chemicals that may trigger the cancer. And so what they'll say is you cannot measure exposure. Well, I think for a certain degree we can. And I think, while you may want to talk about a fetus being exposed to a lower dose than to an adult, I think to a certain degree our level of regulations for toxicological exposures are pretty good. And they continue to get lower and lower. And so we have to understand that the levels that we're at today of risk management are very effective. And of course, risk management is not the same as uncertainty management, but risk management is simply measuring the exposure and controlling the exposure. Uncertainty management is different. Uncertainty management is if we're uncertain at what level of exposure, then we take precaution. And precautionary principle comes in on a hazard-based approach. Because what happens with precaution is no level of exposure is safe because a hazard is a risk. Therefore, if something is a hazard, we must remove it. Well, there are a lot of very beneficial things. This cup of coffee, which is getting cold now, this cup of coffee has a lot of very important beneficial elements inside. It has a lot of toxins and carcinogens as well. But I consider that, because it's natural, nobody considers it, honestly, but I consider the benefits to a certain degree worth it. So I think one of the important points to realize is that a risk manager, a regulator, has to look at exposure, not just the fact that there is a hazard that they have to remove, because you will take away all the benefits. Do we ban all cars? I mean, that's a ridiculous element. I'm looking for my phone. I don't have my phone here. But my telephone emits radiation in a very small level into the sort of soft caverns next to my brain. Do we ban all phones because of that very low dose of radiation? Well, we would ban everything if we followed the hazard-based approach. It's not a rational level. Glyphosate was proven by IARC to be a carcinogen by a hazard-based approach. So they took, it wasn't a question of how much we are exposed to it. You could take, 10,000 times the weight of a mouse in glyphosate, just keep pushing it there. Notice that the mouse gets a bit confused and say, aha, look, you see, that's dangerous. But if you were to put it to the normal exposure levels that humans, not humans eating a bowl of cereal in the morning, but a farmer applying it, you'd say the exposure levels here are so low, and the toxicity level is so low. It's a very low toxic level for glyphosate. There is almost no risk. But if you only look at the fact that the hazard, look at this mouse, it's not doing too well. This is what Cirolini did. Then if you only take the hazard, then of course you'll ban it. But you have to ban everything. You have to ban all synthetic pesticides. You have to ban all natural pesticides. You'll have to ban cars, telephones, computers, technology. We'll go back to caves. And some people are okay with that.
Okay, so what they're trying to do here when they're trying to build a case against a certain chemical is that they either come up with studies where they expose, for example, animal models to really high doses of those chemicals, or that they assume that if people are exposed to low doses over long periods of time, they assume there that they will develop those same problems. Is that how they make their case?
Yeah, and in fact, I think today we're stuck in a causality relationship that every cancer has a cause. Every disease is caused by something, and if we can find that, then we're going to... there was a study out 2 years ago that came to the conclusion that 66% of all cancers are simply bad luck. A switch goes on at some point, one cell mutates, and it's just bad luck. And of course, most toxicologists and chemists would agree with that, but the epidemiological community and the biologists just went crazy about this. You can't say that. It's not bad luck. Somehow cancer is a justice for somebody. You smoked, you have cancer, how dare you, you know? And it's almost the level of, you know, rage that you find from some of these people is quite frightening. And that need to be able to indicate a very clear causal link to very complicated lives that people lead has become, well, ridiculous. And in the end, I've had a series of bad luck in my health for the last year. I'm not going to sit down and say, well, who can I sue or who can I say is responsible for this? You have to accept that. And I think that's one of the things that most people will not be able to accept, that there isn't a clear causal relationship. The courts, of course, benefit from having a causal relationship, but that's not good science. And I think quite simply because, well, there isn't one science. A biologist is quite different from a chemist or a toxicologist. An epidemiologist or a statistician, these are the ones looking for the answers. Everything has to have an answer. And it creates more fear and uncertainty in our lives. And of course, getting back to your first point, we want simplicity. We want to know that this groundskeeper used glyphosate for 2 years. 2 years. Imagine a cancer forming in 2 years. Imagine that. And therefore, Monsanto has to pay. Very simple. It doesn't matter what other lifestyles issues he has. It doesn't matter about anything else. We need one clear answer, and that's it. Okay. What's going to happen if in 5 years' time we start noticing maybe about 1% of the population having a small tumor somewhere on this side of their brain? Okay. Let's hope it doesn't happen. But we say that it is only because of cell phones. That will be the general outcome. But these people have lived very complicated lives with a lot of other technologies, a lot of other products. It could be 1,000 other things coming in. But the media, the policy world, the lawyers all want one very clear, simple answer. And they will draw that line. And anything that gets in the way of that clear, simple line they want to have will be dispelled. It's not accepted.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, in this discussion, I guess that one of the things that most people are not aware of or they don't think about is the fact that if we are forcefully identifying certain chemicals as causing certain types of cancer, for example, and we put our efforts and our money into that, then perhaps we are neglecting the real causes of cancer that then we neglect them, and perhaps it is also dangerous in terms of health because we are misidentifying the real causes of cancer, correct?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the first points to realize is that the cancer rate's going down. And that's a surprise people are not prepared for, because 20 years ago, I knew maybe 1 or 2 people in my family or some friends who had cancer, and it was a terrible thing. Today on social media, I also know friends of friends who have cancer. I see people with sites where they're blogging about fighting cancer. So I see cancer everywhere. If I decide, if I have a headache, I'll Google it, and Google will tell me, of course, I have cancer. In fact, I think Googling the word cancer gives you cancer. So, and so the idea, of course, that the recent statistics showed, first of all, that the incidence level of cancer, it's stable for women, but it's gone down 2% for men over the last, I think, over the last 15 years. But as well, the cancer survival rate is up. So if you take survival rates, it's up 27%. Now we're living longer. People used to drop dead in the streets in their 50s from heart disease. Now they're living into their 70s, and that's a good example of where these cancers, which many times take 40 years to metastasize, most people would have died before. In fact, they say about prostate cancer, more men die with prostate cancer than from prostate cancer. The level of incidence is going down, means that this whole fear industry built around cancer is built around the perception we have for social media. But in reality, the technologies for treating cancer are going up. The incidence levels are going down. Much of that has to do perhaps with the decline in smoking levels. But we shouldn't be so afraid. We shouldn't be so afraid of technology. We shouldn't be so afraid of nuclear energy. We shouldn't be so afraid of GMOs, of the food we eat. So what's causing this increase in fear? What's causing this increase of anxiety towards industry when industry is becoming more benign? What's causing this increased fear of the technologies that we're using every day? It's not the technologies, it's not the science. It has to do with the social media and the gurus that are out there who are benefiting from the opportunities of having vulnerable people finding each other. And that's what social media has created. It's created these circles where people will believe that you shouldn't vaccinate your children, or they'll believe that these exhaust fumes from airplanes is dropping chemicals on us, chemtrails. And they'll believe a lot of crazy things because they're finding each other now. And they'll believe that cancers are going up because if I tell them, no, it's gone down, they'll say I'm a shill for the chemical industry.
Yes, right.
Yes. And they won't listen to me, so because they need to hear that it's going up because they need to be afraid.
Yes. Okay, so Dr. Zaruk, let's end the interview here, but before we go, apart from your blog, are there any other online sources that you would like for people to know about if they want to know a little bit more about the issues that we've been discussing today?
Wow. I mean, the difficulty with a lot of organizations is that today we're getting more and more into individual areas. So there's no real, one good site I want to say necessarily. There are some very good people out there with very good blogs, of course. There are some good organizations that are doing a lot of interesting work. Cornell, for example, has the Alliance for Science. Which is coming up with, they're not just coming up with very good articles, but they're doing some amazing things. I have to be careful about shout-outs because shout-outs to certain organizations, and that I think you've got a lot of very good scientists who are sharing very good ideas. Unfortunately, there are a lot more organizations that are with an agenda and doing and saying things that are quite frightening. And so I think one of the things that I tell my students, and this is one of the dangerous things when my students do research, is I begin to see what they discern as credible sources, is it's quite frightening, especially today, because a lot of the media organizations, even big media organizations like The Guardian, Le Monde, The New York Times, these media organizations are becoming campaign driven. They're running environmental campaigns because their business model has changed, and they're almost becoming media driven NGOs rather than media organizations. So I tell my students that they have to have a certain, what I call credibility sniff, like picking up an apple. You've got to look at that apple and you've got to make a determination, is this apple going to be, a good apple, or when I bite it, will I find some worms inside? And so they have to take any information that they find online and do research. And that research will include seeing where their sources are coming from, seeing if there are no references to any other main sources, that's already a good indication that it's a campaign-driven organization. Be very aware of what you find on the first 5 offers from Google, because Google of course wants to give you what you want to hear. And so the algorithms now are beginning to influence how people find information. if I've clicked on 5 links in the past, Google will send me to links similar to that. They won't send me to more objective sites. And so I basically, rather than giving sites, I'd have to say there's a certain technique to be able to judge the credibility of the sources, because you will have sources that are going to be agenda-driven, going to be, giving only one side of the argument quite frequently. And so you've got to be able to discern today in a very rigorous way whether something is credible or not. And usually also the social media discussions will help you. You'll find out within social media the types of people who are commenting and discussing. And if it's a very wide mix, it's usually more interesting than something that very clearly is speaking out of one tribal tongue. So I don't know if that helps, but it was a lot easier when I was young and I went into a library and I took a book off a shelf. It was quite clear what that book had been vetted and deemed objective. It's a lot harder today for young people, I think.
Yeah, I imagine it is. Okay, so Dr. Zaruk, let's end on that note. And it was a real pleasure to have you on the show. I've been a big fan. So again, thank you a lot for taking the time.
And thank you. I look forward to seeing this and hearing more from you.
Hi guys, thank you a lot for watching this interview until the end. I'm recording a new ending just to let you know a couple of new things, but I've started this channel in February 2018 and I've been putting out a lot of interviews with academics and intellectuals. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And if you don't like Patreon or prefer other platforms, you can also go to PayPal and subscribe from $1 to $20. I have all of those options in the description box of the video, and you can also make a one-time donation on PayPal. And also you can go to Subscribestar and pledge any amount there, so you have all of those options to support the channel. And so before I go, I would like to give a huge thank you to my patrons: Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, and I'm very proud of this, my first producer, Izar Webb. Thank you for all.